Sure everything's good. Hey, looks good. Right. Okay, welcome everyone. We're just waiting for a minute. Thank you all for being here. We're just going to wait a minute before introductions and before we get started. I will let you guys know. Okay. All right. Okay, there we go. I think it's time to get started. So everyone, my name's Amanda Vanessa, and I'll be your moderator today. I just want to thank you all for coming to this session. It's a great opportunity. Our speakers today are Cheryl Smith, Brooke Richardson, Nicole Handrigan, and Ashley Gosse. And the title of the presentation that we have today is A Thought Experiment, Rewriting Our Child Protection Stories Through an ADR Lens. I want to thank you for patience with any tech issues, because if it's going to happen, it'll happen in this room. You never know. But if you do lose connection, if you go back to that main room, that would be great. Just go back there and they'll direct you from there and help you out. Yeah, so I think that's about it. We'll get started here. So I will just hand it over to you to share your presentation. Thank you.
All right, Nicole, you're going to share it, hey?
I am, yeah. Just give me 1 second there.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Ashley Gosse, and I've been practicing as a registered social worker since 2013. I am currently completing my master's degree from Wilfrid Laurier University, and I've spent almost 10 years in the child welfare system in Newfoundland and Labrador. I can honestly say that even with 10 years experience in child welfare, I was not familiar with ADR, which is a little bit embarrassing to say. So first thing we're going to do today is start with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are gathered today on Turtle Island, which is the ancestral homelands to many Indigenous people and their ancestors, whose culture has been forever lost. We recognize all the Indigenous people who were here before us, those that live with us now, and the generations to come. We offer this acknowledgement to recognize our ancestors and the history of the land that is currently shared by many. We celebrate their longstanding contribution and recognize their resilience. We also acknowledge the enduring presence and deep traditional knowledge and perspectives of the Indigenous people with those among us. We continue to learn from Indigenous ways of being in the world and are grateful for each opportunity to learn more about these practices. We open our hearts and our minds to the past while we work towards a better future, centered on truth, reconciliation, and respecting all cultures and traditions of those whose lands we share. As Indigenous people have always done, we strive to respect the land, the cultures, ceremonies, and traditions of those who call it home. Linking this back to today's topic, Indigenous ways of being are the origin point of ADR practices and principles. Family group conferencing, and ADR, was developed in New Zealand in the late 1980s when the indigenous peoples of the tribe Maori sought an, I may not be saying that right, sought an alternative to the high number of their children in the child welfare system. As a result of implementing ADR and family group conferencing perspectives, there was a sharp decline in the number of children in foster care. As a result, in 1989, the New Zealand legislation changed to require a referral when a police officer or social worker verifies abuse or neglect, or when an emergency case of child abuse or neglect is brought to the attention of the court. It is now mandated that a referral be made and is no longer considered optional. ADR has gained momentum over the past 15 years in Canada, but our neighbors south of the border have been using this practice for some time. Specifically in Ontario, ADR and family group conferencing is not required to be implemented, but is rather to be considered as per CFSA legislation 20.2-1, which stipulates if a child is or may be in need of protection under the Act, a society shall consider whether a prescribed method of ADR could assist in resolving any issue related to the child or a plan for the child's care. Additionally, the Children's Aid Society policy CW 005-02 or 06 indicates that there is a limited number of prescribed methods approved by CAS. They noted that ADR is relatively new and new policy direction for them, and as a result, preference will be given to methods that have been well established. ADR has been used across the globe for decades, with results that reduce the number of children in foster care and in need of out-of-home placements. ADR is not widely used as much as it could be when it is deemed optional or to be considered. It is often not selected. In this presentation, you will hear lived experience within the child welfare system. You will hear real stories and how things could have been different if ADR was required and not just an optional consideration. With that, I'm going to pass it along to Brooke to start us off.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having us. I just want to let you know that I'm joining from Ukjibuktuk, or what is the colonial lands of colonially known as Halifax. And like Ashley said, while I want to acknowledge the land that I'm on, I want to place particular emphasis on the offerings that Indigenous ways of being and knowing bring to light and illuminate. And I do see, strong connections between an ADR principles and practices and Indigenous ways of knowing and being. So I want to hold that and honor that and not try and claim that as my own. I joined today. I wear many hats, but I'm here today to really focus on sharing my lived experience. And I also wear a hat of a child and youth professor, an early childhood educator, and social justice advocate. But, my life really changed when I became involved in the child protection system. So I don't know if you want to switch the slide to the next slide. So when I was preparing for this, actually, I have the notebook right here. Oh, isn't that bizarre? But when we started talking about this presentation, I went back to my bookshelf and I pulled this journal off the shelf because it was what I was writing everything down on when everything was happening. So those are just some of my scribbled notes that to get through it, I would take notes so that it didn't feel like it was happening quite so much to me. And then I remember looking at the only in darkness can you see the stars and thinking that is just complete BS. All I could see was darkness. So I'm going to share with you a piece I wrote about that day of the case conference. I will never forget the feeling on that car ride to the CAS case conference. Up until that point, I thought that maybe my voice, my experience mattered. But an impending sense of doom overcame me. I left my baby with a friend's nanny, so they couldn't take her while I was at this conference. I could barely breathe. I knew I had to keep it together, though everything in my mind and body was breaking, my heart most of all. No tears, no vulnerability allowed. I can say with absolute certainty that the day of the case conference was the worst day of my life. In every other situation I've been in, including situations where I was being abused or exploited, I knew what I needed to do, and I had some agency to do it. But that case conference, I was worse than nothing or no one. I was the villain, positioned as a liar, a person whose truth couldn't be trusted. From the moment we all took our seats at the table, the shards of hope I'd managed to salvage up until that point were incinerated. And the ashes weren't just burning me, they were blowing up my family and faith in humanity. It quickly became clear that this was no place to problem solve. The problems had been defined by others with input from us, tokenistic at best. All I could do is step in line, stay quiet, strategize in opposition to these people who were claiming to help. There was one point in this meeting where the doctor asserted that the marks on my baby, marks that appeared in the hospital on the X-ray table, were from a previous injury. That was when the last shard of hope disintegrated. I disintegrated. My mind shut down. I floated above my body. My husband, at the time, and me locked eyes. We knew. We had the right to remain silent and truly nothing else. We had our orders, 24/7 supervision for an indefinite period of time. Phone calls were made, schedules were hammered out. When the CAS team left the room, I tried to stand up, but I fell to the floor. Commotion, chaos. There had been difficult times in my life, and there would be more difficult times in my life, but this was different. My agency was being treated as dangerous. I could exist in the world only through other people's realities because my reality was a lie. And on paper, it still looks this way. It is really painful for me to look back on this day. It makes my heart hurt and my eyes well with tears because I lost myself. My truth was taken. And when your truth is taken, there's nothing left. And the only way to survive in this situation was to surrender my truth and play the part I'd been cast in as cleverly as I could. Me and my family and those who cared about, for, and with us maneuvered through the highest stakes game of chess. Their move, our move. Their move, our move. Over days, weeks, months, I came to believe their truth as my truth and lost myself to keep my family together. Getting myself back, I'm still working on it. Sharing my story, it's part of the healing, but it's painful. I wish we didn't have to rip apart to come together, but we do. And I'm grateful that you're listening, that you're open to finding alternatives to the violence that characterizes too many existing child protection principles and practices. Anyone who knows me knows I believe systems can do better. I am not an expert on ADR. I am an expert on care as theory and practice. And I know that ADR, while not perfect, is an attempt to systematically make child protection practices more caring. I therefore applaud all of you, and I'm honored to be here with you today. That is my experiential piece, and I will pass it over to Cheryl. And I should just say before I do that, the pieces of art that we've included in this presentation are all Cheryl's pieces. You're muted, Cheryl. You're muted.
My apologies. Thank you. I will explain too that we're doing this in two parts. So this part is the experience part, and then the next part will be the reimagining. So I'd like to first acknowledge, and I'm just bringing up my paper, that I am in Stratford, Ontario, and situated on the land that was shared between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe and the neutral, and I'm not sure how to say this, but I hope I say it okay, Adawandran peoples. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to live, work, and play on this land, and hope to treat it with the respect of those before me. I also wanted to say my name is Cheryl, and I am an ADR coordinator, but I've also worked in the field for a long time, 13 and a half years. This is part of my story, and I'd like to dedicate this presentation, or my part of it, to my ADR team, especially Rhonda, Marilee, and of course my family. January 26th. Today, I sit in a small, cozy coffee shop in a small town, contemplating on what to write or how I'm going to get ready for the presentation I'm doing in February. How might family group conferencing change the trajectory of my life? How do I write that while honoring all of those I love and the experiences that brought me here today? I ordered a macchiato. I thought it was a chocolate flavored coffee. I can hear a buzzer in my head. Nope, it's espresso. Needing the motivation and not wanting to waste it, I sip it after adding multiple heapings of sugar. I feel a slight churn in my stomach, perhaps indigestion. Perhaps an inkling of compassionate angst growing inside me, bubbling so close to the surface I can feel it in my fingertips. I think of the comedy of errors and wrong turns that accumulated like an avalanche, smothering our lives with embers and ashes of what could have been. The lady with the black boots came with her agenda, our innocent faces locked behind the windshield of the tan Chevy. The following series of unfortunate events, unlike the movie, were impenetrable by our toddler hands or spirits. These memories are woven in the cloak or cape of an institution designed to sever any resemblance of familiarity or family to protect children from the pathologized individual and their humanity. The inherited guilty verdict as deemed by society and subsequent flogging pitched on the banner, stitched on the cape, thrown on the shoulders of the lady with the black boots. This is to say, those weighted with the cape of carrying out the protection of children are laden with the burden of the dismantling families for the sake of safety. My familiar relations, a seemingly unbreakable bond, was fragmented, ripped from us as we drove away from the scene. Well, it may be true we needed some extra support, some hope, some community. Perhaps this could have manifested as some mutual aid where no one person, perspective, or experience was above another. February 7th. Today I met with a supportive network. They gently reminded me that it's okay to refocus my energy, soul, and mind back to this, unbeknownst to them. I sip my coffee and I think back. Growing up, I imagined that I was like Annie, the little girl in the movie that was in an orphanage, dreaming of being held once again by her parents and family. There must have been a mistake. There must have been some unpredictable event that dropped her in this place. They would come back for her. They love her. In the end, her parents turn out to be criminals who attempt to use Annie to extort money, and Daddy Warbuck saves the day with his love, charm, and lavish lifestyle. Perhaps seeing it now through the eyes of an adult, a shockingly true reflection of societal expectations, norms, and misgivings. In one fell swoop of a brush, my entire family, including me, were casted in the parts of the criminals, impoverished, and indeed in need of reform. My parents, charmed by the system's promise, not unlike Daddy Warbuck saving the day for us to have a better life, agreed that we would be better off. Except the system is more like a snake charmer who compels the unknowing animal to emerge from its cocoon, only to be tricked, puppeteered, and cast away again for the safety of all around. But that safety was as imaginary as Annie's happy ending. And I'll pass this along to Nicole.
Thank you, Cheryl. I guess just to build on the land acknowledgement, Ashley and I are both joining from the island colonially known as Newfoundland and Labrador. We respect this land as the unceded homelands of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit. I'm currently an MSW student at Laurier. I have been practicing as a social worker in Newfoundland and Labrador for approximately 17 years. The bulk of my career, probably about 15 years of that, was spent within child welfare. So I've only really exited the system within the past 2 years or so. So that's kind of a little bit about who I am. And This is not easy stuff to talk about in terms of when you're talking your own personal lived experience, but I do believe that it's important. So, in terms of the purpose of the following story being written are to walk us through one person's experience of a child welfare investigation without the use of ADR. And as my peers have said, then we're going to do a re-envisioning of what it could have been if ADR had been applied. I'm also not an expert in ADR, but I do believe in sharing vulnerably and authentically while amplifying the voices of those with lived experiences. So this is my narrative without ADR. Parenting can bring the highest of highs and the lowest of lows, while simultaneously teaching us the true meaning of unconditional love. This has been especially true for her as she learns how to navigate parenting a child with complex medical and mental health needs. She loves fiercely, which led to years of balancing her career while also juggling many things to meet the needs of those around her, all the while often sacrificing her own needs. She is not perfect, none of us are, but she attends every medical appointment, even when away for work or out of town, and attends by phone while Dad sits in the doctor's office with an incredibly detailed list containing very specific questions to ask and updates to provide the medical team. She spent years leaving work to pick up her son each and every time there was a behavioral concern or challenge, or she just felt like he needed the comfort and safety of home that day. Years of advocating for inclusion, support, and basic human rights. Years of doing this while on fumes for sleep and still managing to help others, all while paying for private services to avoid lengthy wait times. Yet, through her exhaustion and frustration, you will see her vulnerable humanity as she weeps, wondering about all the ways she believes she has somehow messed him up. She has experienced many traumas throughout her life, both in personal and professional lives, and wanted her son's experiences to be different. She will never forget that day. It is not one that can ever be erased. It lives rent-free in her head forever. One that she never thought was possible, and one that forever changed who she was, causing her to question everything she once knew. She remembers that day as a day when her fears were allowed to run wild, no longer silenced by herself or others, often stating that her fears were irrational. Until that day, she did have fears of the system knocking on her door, but managed to suppress these fears with justifications, that if a knock ever did come, it would be a minor inconvenience in her life, but one with little to no impact. After all, she had spent over 14 years enacting and enforcing that very system and being the investigator knocking on the doors of others. She knew that no one has immunity from the knock happening, but felt prepared to navigate it if ever it did happen. She knew the investigation process intimately, knew the policy governing decisions. She had afforded privileges, knew the risk factors used to measure safety, and dismissed the fears of this knock until it happened, and she could no longer hide behind the justifications that it would be okay. The first knock was the worst time, though she lives in residual fear of more to come and has been through several now. She now feels terrified whenever a private number calls her phone or an unexpected knock comes to the door. She feels the tears fall down her face each time she has to call the police for help, or worse, when her son gets an unexplained bruise. Sheer panic creeps up when she has to seek medical care outside of his primary care team, the people who don't know her well. A small fear has grown into large ones of people misconstruing brief snippets of her life without context and without understanding of why conventional parenting is not her goal. It's part of why she overshares in efforts to explain the truthful narrative before others write it for her. Her afforded privileges did not keep her safe, and she suddenly felt the power shift as she went from the investigator to the investigated, yet still had to keep it together for the sake of her child. He saw them as friendly visitors at the school and door and held so much excitement as Nan moved in, with zero awareness that this was an invasive safety plan used to band-aid until further investigation could occur. What felt scary and agonizing for her meant her son got to stay safe in his own home and his routine. She felt powerless to resist and can only imagine how others feel. She had spent hours providing her narrative, hoping that it would not be rewritten on the paper. She provided 15 collaterals, knowing the system usually only asks for 2. Her worst nightmare came true the moment she was asked to sign that invasive safety plan, yet what this really meant was silently omitted. Sign, or else risk further intrusive measures and a possible warrant as a next step. Her beliefs of being able to easily navigate crashed as a family member moved in to supervise their every move. Afraid to resist, especially with the risks of this being her own employer, she signed the plan. The plan went into effect before calls were made to collaterals, despite one being the doctor responsible for child welfare investigations, who had just happened to clear their schedule and provide a personal cell phone for this call to happen. She quietly cooperated with the police investigation, but was disheartened to hear that they were persuaded to investigate by the agency because of her role, and not because they felt the allegations necessarily warranted it. Of course, she understood liabilities of working in the system with vulnerable children and families tasked with keeping them safe, all the while accused of not keeping her own. She wept as she was taken off client contact and silently put on writing duty, all while hurting the client she had made commitments to. The file did open and close within the mandated 30-day time frame. There were no findings of harm. It's not always the case, but she was relieved when cleared of all the allegations and findings of harm, but remains haunted by the realities that remain. Her reality is that child welfare entered her home under the guise of keeping her child safe, when in actuality it harmed her and her family in irreparable ways. It was then that she fully saw the power for what it was, not just the ability to remove a child, but ability to police others and make them feel as powerless as she. She was used to the system taking from her after working long hours and sacrificing the needs of her own for the system, but she will never regain what the system takes personally. She now tries to bring that lens and awareness to her work as she unlearns from colonial and violent systems that can often feel punitive. I am going to pass it back to Brooke now for a re-envisioning. I'm just going to get back through the slides.
Just stop sharing, I think, Nicole, just so they can,
Yeah.
we can spotlight.
Okay. Yeah, but that's what I'll do then. That's fine.
Yeah,
and then I can put it back up when I need to for the questions.
Yeah. So each of us has kind of shared taking pieces that resonate with us in our own experiences, and then the challenge was to imagine how it could have been different if these principles and practices were actually could be practiced. So in what remains of my time, I'd like to offer an imagining of how things could have played out different for me, or what could have happened if even some principles of ADR were meaningfully taken up in my own particular case. And as I said, it is an imagining. But if we don't imagine, we don't create space to build something better. And because I recognize existing structures are institutionally entrenched, I imagine something that is not a complete abolition of the system. Not that I'd be opposed to that in any way. So here it goes. I'm on my way to the case conference, this time which will be rooted in ADR principles and practices, family agency, voice, power sharing, context, and cultural sensitivity, creative problem solving, all with the fundamental goal of caring well for my child and therefore caring well for me and my family. I'm scared, of course, as everything has happened so fast. There's so much uncertainty and the stakes could still not be higher. But I want answers and solutions as much as everyone else coming to this meeting. And me and everyone else coming to this meeting also want to make sure my child is okay. There are just so many unknowns. I arrive with my support team to the meeting. The meeting is not labeled or titled Alternative Dispute Resolution or Family Group Conferencing. It's still just called the Case Conference, like it always has been. But now at ADR Lens has been implemented system-wide, and these case conferences are now all rooted in the principles and practices described above. And to be honest, that's more what I expected when I went to this meeting in the first place, because I do not have a child protection background. The meeting's at a community center. So we arrive. It's not in this intimidating high-story office building in downtown. We were booked into one of the meeting rooms. Me, my support people, includes my parents, my sister, my best friend, and my friend's a colleague. We come in. We make our way to the room where others are coming in as well. A facilitator trained in ADR, employed by a provincially funded nonprofit organization, is there to greet everyone as they arrive. Everyone in the meeting has had a chance to talk to this facilitator before the meeting. Let's call her Sam. Because I had a chance to talk to Sam before this, I'm slightly comforted, and at least she knows how distraught, scared, and confused I am, but I'm still very wary. The doctors, hospital social worker, and CAS worker arrive, all of whom are known to me. And unlike my experience, they were able to make eye contact with me and I with them. Sam facilitates introductions whereby we all make explicit our roles and responsibilities in this case. Rather than trying to maintain stoicism, looking strong and together, I'm able to express my confusion and voice the many questions and concerns I have about my daughter. I'm allowed to be upset. I'm allowed to cry, and that's not seen as a liability or as a weakness. Everyone in the room listens to where I'm at and what I need in order to care well for my daughter, who at this point I am convinced is ill. The CAS worker and the doctor make their roles explicit and explain what their involvement has been thus far. We identify what decisions have to be made in this meeting so that we can best meet the needs and responsibilities of all involved. It is extremely difficult to sit there and listen to the doctor's narrative of 2 broken knees and unexplained bruises that was from a previous injury. But I try really hard to appreciate her responsibilities in this and the difficult situation she is in. Unlike what really happened, I'm able to express my concern about a lack of certainty in the diagnosis and the weight of this diagnosis. Because the doctor who's been handling my case is leaving on vacation for 2 weeks the next day, her colleague is also attending the meeting to ensure continuity of care in her absence. The social worker, who is also quite puzzled, has braced to express her confusion or her worries that she will be blamed if something happens to this child. She's also able to say that her interactions with the family, including the children, does not fit with a narrative of acute physical abuse. Once we all have the opportunity to share our needs and responsibilities, we begin coming up with ideas on how to navigate the next few days and weeks. There's space for uncertainty on the medical front. I am part of coming up with a solution that includes a great deal of social support because just the involvement of CAS in and of itself is traumatic over the next few weeks. No threats are made. If that's that there was lots of threats made about if I didn't follow it, then she would be apprehended. Because I feel heard and respected by everyone in the room, instead of humiliated and shamed, I'm more able to accept support from the people who care about me and my family. I clearly explain how and why I feel like 24/7 would be more harmful than helpful. Everyone agrees that the degree of oversight does harm, and this is just simply not sustainable. I agree to reach out to some of my supports if I am feeling stressed or unable to cope, which, quite honestly, I was very overwhelmed and stressed. I leave the meeting feeling shaken, but human. The facilitator meets with me after the meeting to debrief and see how I'm doing. Part of the plan is that I'll touch base with Sam every week to let her know where I'm at, if there's been any further developments, etc. The others in attendance will do the same. It feels like the other people in this meeting are also motivated to try and get more information and to share the information rather than me trying to pull teeth to get anybody any information. The doctors and social workers are permitted to express their concerns to Sam. What if we don't call these fractures and they are? What happens to me? It's all on the table. This plan, which I've been genuinely part of constructing, buys us enough time to get the hard copy medical records whereby the uncertainty in the medical diagnosis becomes clear, something which was hidden for 5 years from me. The doctors are able to acknowledge that the possibility exists that the blurriness on the images could be something else. At this point, Sam and the CAS worker have developed a strong working relationship with us, and they've spent tons of time in our home interacting with me, interacting with my children, interacting with our family. And everyone recognizes that this narrative that's been constructed just doesn't make sense. But CAS remains involved, and because it's not a terrible experience, I don't mind. I actually like Sam and have formed a relationship with Sam, and Sam and the social worker have formed relationships with my children. I was never acutely fearful of the involvement because I always felt heard, and so it doesn't feel as much as an intrusion in my life as a resource. In fact, I've specifically requested to remain in touch with Sam when our case is closed at CAS, as I don't like the idea, and neither do my children, of her just disappearing. Furthermore, my children have come to expect these people around. My life was interrupted, ruptured, shaken, but I didn't lose my faith in humanity and/or systems and structures that are meant to care about, for, and with everyone. Over to Nicole.
Oh, I think, are we going, Cheryl? That's
Sorry,
okay.
Cheryl.
I
my
just
bad.
want to be clear so that I know I can totally go, but I
It's
think we're going
all
to pass over
good.
Cheryl.
I'm easy to get along with. I can go next. Part 2. February 9th, 2024. Today, I drove along in the sunshine listening to the We Can Do Hard Things podcast as they talked about incorporating more play and fun into their lives. I was reminded how precarious and fragile life is as another car almost sideswiped me going over 80 kilometers an hour. The pit in my stomach began to ache as all the faces of my children and family flashed before me, and I drifted off into the memory of meeting my brother, my biological parents, and family again, then in my 30s. I thought of how extraordinary it was that I got to meet my paternal grandmother before she passed away. Then thought of how unfair it was that I could not remember my maternal grandparents or grandfather, as we never got to see them again. On a pretty chilly day in 2016, I sat in a room full of strangers with my new colleague who quickly became one of my dearest friends. I tried to listen intently as the trainers discussed the principles of family group decision-making, and somewhere between transparency and empowerment of families, my stomach began to grumble. I hoped it wasn't loud enough for everyone to hear. Well, it's true, I hadn't eaten breakfast, as I rarely do. I sensed it really wasn't the source of the gurgle, as I was transported to a distant but not unfamiliar place. A vision of me 30 years before at 16. I thought how ironic, or maybe poetic justice that it is, that I now sit in a meeting room in Toronto, the very place they left me alone without food or shelter or anyone to turn to. Even more ironic that I was now working for the same system that abandoned me. My mind lurched back into the room as they announced the break for lunch. Despite drifting off, the discussion prompted me to think, if FGDM had been thought of or the principles implemented, I imagine, unlike Annie's story, my family would have been an integral part of my life, not villains or heroes, but tangible, real people. And therefore I, the capital I, would have been real too. I imagine my brother and sister and I having play dates instead of my sister and I losing memory of him as we grew. I imagine my biological parents sharing pictures, stories, letters, and maybe hugs through celebration and loss, instead of being cast away due to the circumstances they could not control at the time. I imagine my adopted mom, I call her mom, receiving the support of the community with honesty, transparency, and compassion as she navigated the harms and traumas of my sister and I's beginnings, along with her own struggles. I imagine instead of all of us being villainized and her being gaslit into believing lies about her children, our voices would have been heard and honored, and we wouldn't have had to take that fateful car ride over and over again. I imagine the Big Macs I obtained by panhandling being bought instead by my uncles or aunties who I had become close to through an intentional building of relationships. I imagine I may have avoided sitting in a jail cell or graduating high school with my peers with the support of my community and family. And though I am certain that no life is perfect and scary, traumatic things happen no matter what you do to try to avoid them, I can't help but imagine that if all the connections had remained strong throughout her life, my 17-year-old niece who took her own life would still be here, laughing at family events, surrounded by all those who love her, and bringing joy and play in every room, I imagine. Sorry, Nicole, you can go.
No, thank you, Cheryl. Just taking a minute to with myself. I've heard it all before, but it's a lot. Now, let's imagine my story a little bit differently. When the knock came, instead of being asked immediately to sign a safety plan, she was met with the option of an emergency meeting. A meeting to determine what reasonable plans there were that perhaps both sides could live with, even if not their first choice. Her choice would have been no safety plan at all. She was informed of the ADR process and invited to sit with her supports, family, the system, and a trained mediator in a confidential discussion about ways to ensure safety, but with least intrusion and less negative impact. Even in the absence of an available ADR practitioner, she imagines differences of at least pulling together the family that day, feeling certain that other options may have appeased both sides. Here, she felt comfortable disagreeing with the 24/7 supervision days before Christmas and was able to voice her son's dysregulation at holiday times, making it even more important that he maintain some structure and routine. Able to voice that her son struggles with transitions and able to voice alternative plans. If changing the full trajectory and dreaming big here, she was able to bring in the medical director who was able to explain the child's needs and dissect why this level of intrusion was not required and no safety plan was required at all. Instead of being afraid to speak up against the very system she works for, not wanting to bite the hand that feeds her, she does speak up, and she's given a trained professional who specializes in alternative resolutions. She's able to voice alternative options, given the knowledge of the mandated role they are in, but also protecting her family unit. She has never disputed that children need safety, but is left wondering whether ADR practices and principles could have led to a different trajectory and one with less residual trauma than the story above. Imagine that she was offered this ADR practitioner, someone to shift the power imbalance to a neutral as possible and bring a voice to the things that she felt voiceless to say. Instead of ADR being a consideration, it was fully implemented and changed the outcomes. Perhaps she would have stayed in child welfare, perhaps not. We will never know. The knock came, but instead of leaving residual fear and panic, it left a family and a social worker intact. This is my story, and I am she, but I am just one of many of the individuals who encounter the system. And I share this story vulnerably with no claims of expertise, but rather hope to open our minds and our hearts to use this as a learning tool, to align ourselves more within the practices of ADR, because I honestly believe that they can be effective. The system will not change overnight, but we each have a power within us to make changes that have a significant impact on the people encountering the system. We can shift from views of liability and risk into lenses stemming from support. I had never once conceived the real possibility of losing my child over an allegation, even if a temporary loss. I knew that the system could come. I knew that it could be scary, but I had never conceived losing my child. I had feared the investigation without imagining that I would be seen as guilty until proven innocent, and that liability could result in an invasive measure. I think that each safety plan I implemented truthfully, I used to think that each safety plan I implemented was necessary. The fear started small but grew big, and I have now survived several investigations. While some close without visits, others bring friendly visitors again. And I hope that the first is always the worst, but we're not out of the system yet. ADR is an important piece if we want to think about restorative justice practices, linking back to Indigenous beliefs, and avoid ways that feel punitive. My home faces more than some will ever have to, and I'm surprised most days that we're still alive, let alone loving each other as fiercely as we do. My experience left me to see how the system can so quickly blame, particularly those who don't fit into the molds or assessments of interventions that we push as best practice. I felt blamed, and I'm sure many others do, for simply trying to survive while facing systemic and practice injustice that only fueled my survival and isolation. Joys in being a mom are now laden with fears of misstep, tainting each decision. And I wonder what could have been if really we had a village by mandatory supporting versus mandatory reporting. I maintain that our investigation could have gone vastly different if only for a few effortless steps, and that these could have led to a different experience, one that did not leave me as traumatized. The system was a large part of my identity and a career that I used to feel confident in, and I was quickly rendered from a knower to a no one. And now I question the harms that I have caused. Yet I still feel lucky as to have my son here with me. There is no place for child abuse, nor a system that polices to protect. And I believe that the system can change and that the realities of community care and authentic support do exist if we just care to embody them in policy and practice. I'm still fearful of potentially speaking out in ways that it can be used against me, but I believe that speaking out today is one way that we can all work towards changing practices and re-envisioning the system using well-known techniques. I am going to share our screen again and just bring up the last slide. So just give me 1 second there.
Just I'll read the quote while you're bringing it up here, Nicole.
Yeah, that would be great.
So while we were preparing these, I stumbled across this quote, which is, "If it were not imagined, it could not be made. Thus, imagination must not be afraid." So with that, we're going to open the floor to questions.
Yeah, just open up to questions and just I just moved away from the slide accidentally, but just basically leaving people to their reflections on re-envisioning the system. So if there's anything anybody wanted to share.
The only other thing maybe we should just mention is that we all have ties to the Child Welfare Truth Telling Collective, which we didn't mention,
Yes.
which is a grassroots organization made up of primarily people who have mostly former child protection workers or people who are still involved in some way, where we really try and support each other and others to speak truth. I'm a bit of an outlier in that don't come from social work. I come from actually early childhood studies is my background. But this is an organization that welcomed me and my truth and really has been super supportive in allowing me to reclaim my story, and also to supportive in terms of imagining something that could have been different. So yeah, with that, I guess I'll mute myself. Ashley, I'll let you facilitate the chat or the questions.
Absolutely. If anybody has any questions for any of the speakers, you can certainly put that in the chat. It looks like we have a large array of people here, so I'm sure there's some questions floating around.
I can.
Oh, I was just going to say, I put the website up as well on the last slide for the Child Welfare Collective, if anybody is looking to check it out. And there are spots to submit your own stories as well. If people are kind of ruminating on their own stories and it can be hard to speak up about your lived experience. So there are opportunities there for that as well.
Margot, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much to all three of you for being so vulnerable and for speaking about your experiences. And it was very powerful. We can talk about ADR, and I do talk a lot about ADR. I'm an FGC coordinator, and I do talk a lot about the benefits of ADR and in the work that I do, but nothing is more powerful than what you three have shared with us today in terms of helping tell the story of how ADR can be so helpful to families involved with child welfare and children caught in the system. As everyone spoke about, the system is really, you can get entangled. And it's very hard to get out. And often, all too often, I hear families talking about their own stories of frustration within it, not feeling heard or and not having a voice. And I know that ADR is often thought of, as a way to avoid court, but it is not just that. The earlier that we can have referrals coming in, and especially with neutral facilitation, I know many CASs are doing internal work, and it's not that they're not doing good internal work in terms of trying to gather people together, but I do always worry about how families feel if they're not able to have that neutral facilitation in preparation for their meetings, so that they can come in with that sense of being prepared, and also just throughout the meeting day. It feels very different to families, I'm sure, to be able to have that. So thank you, all three of you, for doing that. It was very powerful.
Thank you, Margot.
If there's no other like overt questions, I have a question that I'd like to throw out to like the participants in the group, because as you know, I said, Cheryl generously invited us kind of here today, and we obviously, me and Nicole and Cheryl and Ashley have a relationship with each other. But I'm curious to hear from you as ADR people, like how does what we've kind of shared, are we getting it? Is it resonating? I mean, I think one of the challenges for sure, which we'll call ourselves out on, is obviously we are three white, relatively privileged, educated women with, that's the only reason we can be here and even share our truths, right? Is because we have protections and resources and language and knowledge that most people don't have. And even for us, it's terrifying to share our stories. So I just wanted to see, I don't know, how it was received for people who are really entrenched in the ADR world.
I don't want to take up all the airways, but if no one's going to say, I might just, I don't know. I feel like you, as I said earlier, like this personal story sharing is just so powerful. I've been in the ADR world for 16 years. And, I can talk about it, but I don't have the lived experience. So in terms of how did it resonate with me, who, practices ADR, family group conferencing, in the most powerful way that it could have. So just to hear your personal experiences and just what it took to be able to do that in such a way, with sharing your stories with all of us, is just extremely powerful, and gives pause, like it gives you pause to think about ADR and how it really can affect, and the work that we do every day hopefully can really affect in families and children that we work with. So thank you again.
And you're right, it's absolutely about putting that humanistic feel to the fact that, changing the legislation and the policy to be more than just considered, to be required. And this is the impact that it can have. And how do we get to that place where we can influence change and make sure that people understand the importance of just changing that wording?
And one thing I want to say, and this is where my scholarly lens comes in here, but I mean, one of the things I often say in a lot of the work that I do is, systems and policies themselves cannot be caring, but they can create the conditions under which good care occurs or not. And I think we need to, I think working, as I said in a meeting recently with Nicole, like working in child welfare and trying to imagine new possibilities, it's like pushing a boulder uphill, like it's exhausting, it's tiring, it's hard. So I think in terms of making those policies and structures, infrastructure in a way that can facilitate good caring, I really hope and invite us all to kind of think together and organize in a way that can bring this into people's imaginations, because it's not there. And if it doesn't exist anywhere in people's imaginations, then nobody knows what we're talking about and nobody knows what we're going for. So I do think, you know, I hope I'm reassured, Marco, by your comments, but I hope that our imaginings create, you know, something that maybe feels a little bit more tangible.
I wasn't sure how to put my hand up, but it's Joanna Goodfellow, and I'm with Nogdwin Mog-Benosia Child and Family Services. It's an Indigenous child and family well-being agency, and I'm a circle facilitator there. So I really appreciate all that you're sharing. And for me, it really means that what we're doing at the agency is really helpful, because we do talking circles. So for child protection matters and such, or if there is a reintegration plan for children to come home, and we sit down and we are neutral in the sense that we don't have access to the family file. We talk to everybody before, just as such in an ADR process, and everyone's voice is very held with respect, and everyone's encouraged to really listen to each other. So I see it really giving the families and the children who sometimes attend that chance to, you know, really share how they're feeling and not feeling in a power imbalance. And we've had a lot of great healing in situations where there have been broken relationship that we've allowed that to be repaired, and the outcome has been much better for the family and the workers and everyone involved. So I just wanted to add that. So thank you again for sharing your stories.
Thank you. Part of the work that the collective does is also some circle work around truth-telling circles for those that have worked within child welfare. You know, we often talk about recognizing the power when you're in that system, and a lot of us do, but I can tell you that I thought I did after 16 years in the system, and it wasn't until the spotlight shone on me that I truly saw the power that we have within that role. And, you know, there are things that I absolutely feel I did good work on, and things that I would absolutely change now that I sit back and look. But it's really scary to tell your story. Like, not a lot of people are talking, right? It's not your dinner table type talk of, yeah, I was investigated. There's a shame, there's a stigma to admitting that, especially as somebody who was in the system and tasked with keeping people safe for so long. But I think that's what brings all of us here together, this group, is the passion to get our voices out there, because it's so important. There are things that you can do within the system now, whether the system changes or not, that can make a big difference on and impact on the people that you're working with. And it does come down to a humanness and just treating each other as humans, and using the ADR principles and practices, right?
Family really does know their story, right? They know it better than anyone. The system tries to understand, but there's nobody that knows more than the family knows. And they especially know that really important ancestral knowledge and like the history of things that, you know, really has influenced where things are at today. I know that if we came together in a family group conference for my family, my mother, who's 91, would hold the most information and have the most power in the room, just because of her age and the stories that she knows and has shared more recently with me, now that she's aging, and has helped unravel my personal story about, you know, my upbringing. It's so important. It's so vital to children and youth and families to understand those things. As you guys are all speaking about your own stories, I am sitting at my desk with my two children's faces looking at me in a photo. They're adults now, but, you know, I really cannot imagine, right, as a mom, going through that, and what lengths I would go to protect my kids and myself and our relationship together. So, and their rights to that relationship with their entire family.
And I think sometimes in child welfare, we are expecting defensiveness and not realizing that's a normal response. If I was on the other side of that door, let me tell you, I would not be an easy client to deal with.
But you have to be.
You have to be.
Yeah,
you have to be.
You're right.
Don't cry,
I
don't
thought the
be
same
distraught.
until I had to be. Yeah. You become, you have to be, you have to play the game. And even with the privileges of knowing the system and knowing the risk assessments and knowing what to say and what not to say, and what they were going to ask and what it meant when they said sign a safety plan, just knowing that the next steps would be a possible warrant to remove, and not even being found of any findings of guilt at that point. It's just an allegation at that point. You're just assessing what's happening. And it's so nerve-wracking to resist. And if I felt that with my privileges, I can't imagine half of the families that I worked with that don't have the knowledge and those privileges, because I couldn't resist it. I would now, but I'm at a different stage than when it first happened, right?
Yeah, there's definite power imbalance, and ADR as its principles and practices. And I know there are CAS, use internal mediators, but in order for people to feel safe, they need somebody who doesn't have a horse in that race to talk to and to share their experiences with and to be there. And it's the hope today that these experiences that these ladies have shared will help prompt some bigger questions and some different thoughts in regards to ADR and how we can move forward with implementing it more. I think we're at
That's
our
wonderful.
out of
Thank
time
you. I
now,
was just
I
gonna
think,
say
are we?
thank you so much for
Everybody.
attending, and we went all the way to 3:30, so that's fantastic. Thank you all for sharing your stories, which was so inspiring. And we'll go back to the main room, but thank you so much. I appreciate
all.
it. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.